Okay, so again, I was saying that when we talk about modern Zionism, after the Chibat Zion Russian Zionist movement, so I want to talk about the aliyot. The first aliyah is 1882. It is still a product of the Russian aliyah, Russian Zionist Chibat Zion movement. And they make settlements in Zichron Yaakov and Rishon LeZion and Petach Tikva and other places. These are smart settlements. In 1897, you have Herzlian Zionism, which is the Basel Conference, the first Jewish Congress or Zionist Congress. And as I said, Herzl is a proud but assimilated Jew who, after the Dreyfus affair in France, he was totally shocked. He realized that if in the Middle Ages, Jews were persecuted by the church because they were a different religion and even by Muslims, so now, even though Jews, many of them are secular, and many of them even assimilated into Christian culture, sometimes adopting the religion, they were still looked down as outsiders, not because of the religion now, because of their ethnicity. They were a different race. The racial theories started to become very popular at the end of the 19th century, and anti-Semitism seems to be growing by leaps and bounds, despite the fact that a lot of Jews are not so religious anymore. So you might say that the experiment of Jews to assimilate into European culture was a failed experiment. The more they assimilated, the more anti-Semitism seemed to be on the rise. So Herzl has this idea, which many before him had too: the Jews need a state. It wasn't even certain to him where the state had to be. If you remember, around 1904, 1905, in the next Congress, in the second or the third Zionist Congress, the British gave Herzl a plan. It was called the Uganda Plan. The Uganda Plan, that the British government is willing to give the Jews a place in Uganda. It actually wasn't in Uganda, it was in Kenya, but it was near the border of Uganda. It was called the Uganda Plan, but it was actually in Kenya, which would have been interesting. If we had set up a Jewish homeland in Kenya, then Barack Obama's father would have been born in the Jewish homeland. This is an interesting concept. Let me put it this way: it wouldn't have worked. It was hard enough getting the Jews back to Israel, which was the land of their history. Any other country would have never worked. 1,000% it wouldn't have worked. Look, you had Baron Hirsch bought lands in Argentina and told Jews they could come to Argentina. You have stories of Jewish gauchos with farms. Yeah, some people went. The Russians told the Jews they can go to Azerbaijan, right? The Russian government had this area somewhere in the east. Yeah, a few Jews went. What did you expect? You really think they're going to go to Kenya? I mean, the whole idea was ridiculous. But only Jews who did not have a country for 2,000 years could have actually thought that this was a serious proposition. Obviously, the British were not taking it seriously and did not actually expect the Jews to say yes. But it was discussed in the Zionist Congress. They took it very seriously. Maybe this is a good way to save Jews from anti-Semitism and pogroms, and then eventually we'll move them to another place. We'll start a country here, then we'll move the country there, you know? Yeah. Yeah, only people who didn't have their own land for 2,000 years could have thought that such a preposterous idea was actually a reality. Well, so it's a good thing in the end it didn't happen, or else it would have been a lot of wasted time and funding. But anyhow, Herzlian Zionism, when Herzl dies, let me mention something else. In 1897, Herzl writes in his diary, he says, "Today, we have established the Jewish state." 1897, he says in Basel. He says, "People don't understand what I'm saying, but in 50 years, they'll know." It was almost prophetic. He says, he writes, in 50 years, they're going to know what I was talking about. Despite that moment of grace, when Herzl dies in, I think, 1905, it didn't look like the Zionist project was going to work. People were not going to Israel. You had one or two kibbutzim, that was it. You had the early settlements from the first aliyah, but it was not happening in any way that would seem to bear fruit. Because to set up a country, the first thing you need is people. Now, how do you get people? There are two ways of getting people. One is if you have a great country. Okay, you have farmland and you have cattle and you have agriculture and you have peace and quiet and you have lakes and snow and places to open up ski resorts, and then people, yeah, that's attractive. But when you have desert and malaria and swamps and mosquitoes and Ottomans, meaning the Turks, are not necessarily that friendly, and it's a little hard to get people to leave wherever they are to come. Even if wherever they are is not the greatest, they figure the evil that we know is better than the evil that we don't know. I mean, that's just human nature. So it was not an easy thing to do. Chaim Weizmann, who eventually was the first president of the state of Israel, in 1921, got together with the Rebbe of Gur, which was one of the Hasidic communities from Poland, and they wrote a letter together to the Jews living in Poland, asking them to make Aliyah to Israel. Didn't work. It was not convincing in 1921. They couldn't understand, like, what was the reason that we were supposed to do that? Things seemed to be okay in Poland in 1921. Remember, it was after the First World War. Poland regained its sovereignty. It was looking favorably at the Jews. Didn't seem to be any reason to leave. Poland, between the wars, by the way, before they were conquered by the Germans, was a relatively liberal and open society, relatively, for those days. They were really trying to make amends. So that didn't work. Let's just think for a moment how you're going to have a state. Now, if somebody actually would tell Herzl or Chaim Weizmann in advance how the state of Israel is going to be set up, people would think that, no, that's cute, but they would think like it's like, I don't know, unimaginable. It was like fantasy. Let's say somebody says, okay, how are we going to bring the Jews to Israel? No problem. First, there's going to be a world war. And after this world war, there are going to be a lot of countries that are going to be granting sovereignty to different states in Europe. And they'll see that the Jews don't have a place. So the Jews will help out a little bit in the war, like Weizmann did. And then they'll get a declaration allowing the Jews to go to their homeland. But that's only phase one, because then you got the Jews to go to the homeland, right? It's not enough just to have a document allowing them. So to get the Jews to go to the homeland, so then there'll be a second world war. And in the second world war, Jews won't be allowed to live in any country, anywhere, except for the one country that hates them, which is Germany. So what they'll have to do, they'll have to leave and come to Israel. Make sense? No. But that's what happened. So if anybody were to tell you exactly in 1905 or 1910 how the state of Israel has come around, you would say, no, that's not possible. The world doesn't work that way. But unfortunately, that's exactly how the world worked. So let's go backwards a little bit. So here we are in 1905, and you have the first kibbutzim. The Ganya in the north. There are moshavot. The kibbutz movement, by the way, is a huge success. I've always said that the most successful form of communism in the world was the Israeli kibbutz movement. It was, on the one hand, communist. Kibbutz means a commune, by the way, in Hebrew. Kibbutz is a commune. It was communal life in a socialist environment where everybody shared in the work, everybody believed in the idea, and the kibbutz movement was so successful that they were self-sustainable communities, economically stable. Some of them actually became wealthy over the years until they put their money into the stock market, which is another story, which happened in the 1980s. I'm just saying. which is, of course, an oxymoron for a socialist kibbutz to put their money in the stock market. But I'm just saying that did happen in the 1980s, but they got over that. But I'm just saying that the kibbutz movement, that was really, it was an interesting experiment and a very successful communal settings of people working together as equal. So I think it's an interesting historical episode, and there have been books written about this. There was a famous book called Children of the Kibbutz, a psychological survey of children living in kibbutzim and how it worked. You know, because some of the kibbutzim actually had children's homes. They didn't live with their parents. I don't know why, but they had such a concept too. This idea that children, to teach them communal life from a young age, that passed eventually in the kibbutz movement. Eventually the kids moved back with the children. But in the early years, they had a lot of these ideas of what the new society should look like. But the kibbutzim were definitely democratic. And they were definitely, in fact, they were very democratic because you had small, you had town hall meetings all the time, like every week. Okay, but getting back to this. So this is the early part. But then, of course, you have the communities, the communities that existed in Israel alongside Zionism of that time. Jerusalem, Tiberias, Safed, Jaffa, Acre. All these had Jews living in these places, Hebron, by the way, and even Gaza had Jewish communities in the early 20th century. The Jewish community by the early 20th century might have reached 100,000 people, maybe. Of course, the amount of Arabs was probably about the same in the early 20th century, for the simple reason there weren't a lot of places to live. Outside of the cities that I mentioned, and outside of the kibbutzim and the moshavim, most of the land was barren. There's a book written by Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, the famous American writer, who went to visit the Middle East in somewhere around 1888, just after the first Aliyah, 1888. The name of his book is called Innocents Abroad. Innocents Abroad. How would you translate that into Romanian?
Ajami în străinătate s-a tradus. It was translated just like this. Ajami în străinătate.
Innocents Abroad. In that book, he comes to visit ancient Israel, which later on will be called Palestine by the British. And sometimes it was called Palestine by the British already in the 19th century. And so he says, as he's going through, he says, this whole land is barren. It's like you can go for miles and miles and not see anybody. And then he says about this land, it says in the book of Leviticus, the Hashimoti, I'm saying in Hebrew because that's the way I remember the verses. I shall bring the land into desolation, and your enemies shall be astonished at how desolate the land is. At the end of Leviticus, he says, definitely when you see the Israel of today, you can see that this verse has come true 100%. There's like nobody around. Then he tells a story that he came to Jerusalem and there he found a tour guide. And the tour guide took him up to the Temple Mount. And he said to him, this was the Temple Mount where David and Goliath used to judge the people. So he walked off the Temple Mount. Another tour guide came over and says, it wasn't David and Goliath, it was David and Solomon. So Twain says, it was very confusing, but maybe the first guy was right. So I think he said that as a joke, though. So even then you had tour guides who took people around, and he was chased by bandits, Bedouin bandits, and all these different excitements and adventures that he had in the Holy Land. But the point is the place was barren. There weren't a lot of people, and you had to fight the malaria in the Jezreel Valley. I mean, it was in the Chula Valley in the north. So it was not the greatest place to be. In 1910, the city of Tel Aviv is established alongside the old city of Jaffa. In 1905, the city of Tel Aviv was established. 1910, the city of Netanya. I can show you a picture. I'm looking for the picture. It's somewhere in here. Book I have from many years ago. A lot of interesting pictures here. Of the Mahabharata, of the camps, of the okay, I should have prepared this in advance, but I didn't think I would be mentioning it, and that's why I did not. Oh, here it is. This is a picture of the establishment of the city of Tel Aviv in 1905. You notice there's nothing there? Yeah, that's Tel Aviv in 1905. A few sand dunes, that's about it. And that's more or less what Netanya looked like in 1910. And that's what Eilat looked like as late as 1950. And Jerusalem was a small town with walls around it. So, as the Jews, by the way, started coming to, then it was called Palestine by the British from 1917, others started coming from other countries. People started coming from Syria and from Egypt because there was work. Where there's work, there are people. That's just the way life works. And since it was the Ottoman Empire and then the British Empire, and the Ottomans controlled all the areas around. So under the Ottomans, it was very easy to go from one place to another. The British also, they controlled Transjordan, they controlled Egypt, together with the British, together with the French, they had Lebanon and Syria. So it was relatively easy for people to cross borders, and where there was work, there was people. So that's, there was actually fights in the early settlements where people would say you're supposed to have Jews came to Israel to work, not to hire other people to do the work for you, or else we didn't have to come. This whole idea of the agricultural ethos of working the land was a big debate in the early years of Herzlian Zionism, which I think I mentioned last time. So idealistic Zionism happens in the first Aliyah and specifically in the second Aliyah. The second Aliyah is the socialist Aliyah. Remember, they came mostly from Russia and Poland, where socialism was the talk of the day. And specifically for Jews, because Jews really hoped that socialism or communism would bring them equal rights, which they never had in these countries. And so and then with the Russian Revolution, Jews were the first one to jump on the bandwagon. Because they were promised that they would have equal rights. And whenever they were promised, it was like giving chocolate to a child for the first time. It's like, it's irresistible. That's exactly what happened. So the second Aliyah is very socialist, it's socialist Zionist, and it believes in labor, and it wants to build up a country. Many of the famous names who will become at the beginning of the state come in the second Aliyah. David Ben-Gurion comes from Russia. His original name was Greenberg. Ben-Gurion was very interesting. He was not the type of person that you would think would be the type of, he was short, but he was smart, articulate, practical, very, very determined. And one of the first things he did, by the way, was go to university in, I think it was Lebanon, and study Arabic. In other words, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted to understand what's going on in the country. And that was already at the end of the 19th century, I think he did that. By the way, Ben-Gurion was called the old man since he was 40 years old. Because a lot of the early Zionists were very young, the ones who came as idealists. Because you're not such an idealist when you hit 40. So you don't go to places where it's desert. But young people, they like adventure, so they're willing to do such things. So I mentioned last time that Aleph Dalet Gordon, who came to Israel at 40, was also called the old man. And the same thing with David ben Gurion. By the time he was 40, he came at a younger age, but by the time he was 40, they called him the old man. So Gordon was one of them, but there were many, many names, Agnon. I can't even remember the names now. But the second aliyah was the aliyah of the ideologues. The ones who in 1905, I mentioned Brenner, I mentioned Gordon. A lot of these people who came also from religious families, but left it and saw Zionism as their new identity, a way to create a new type of future for the Jewish people that everybody will one day understand the importance of this. By the third or fourth aliyah, I keep forgetting the exact dates, things start changing. Let me put it this way. 1930 is a watershed movement time in the history of Zionism. You have idealistic Zionism until 1930-31. And the British, of course, are in charge. The British receive a mandate from the UN to create the infrastructure of a state which eventually will be the Jewish state. Remember, 1917, there is the Balfour Declaration, and Lord Balfour is told by Her Majesty the Queen that she is, well, that's just the way they say it. It's really the Parliament sees it favorable to grant the Jews a homeland in Palestine. By the way, Palestine in 1917 included all of Israel and Transjordan together. That was Palestine of the British mandate. What will happen later is that the British will change their mind and say, we set a homeland in Palestine. We never said all of Palestine, but the British were just like that. So what happens is, so they get a mandate, and then as you remember, and then the mandate is from the British government and the UN, and the idea is to eventually give it over to the Jews. That's not exactly what they do, but that was the mandate that they had, and it was called the British mandate. By the way, the flag of the British mandate was a Magen David, just for your information. So, meaning when the state was called Palestine, the flag was a Magen David. Some people don't know that. Anyhow, getting back to this. The Yishuv starts realizing they have to grow, but the British are not so crazy about it. They create these white papers. But before the white papers, I want to tell you a strange story. 1930-31, the organization which starts running the Jewish communities from that second Aliyah group is called the Jewish Agency. They set themselves up in order to be in charge of the Jewish settlements in Palestine at the time. Ben Gurion eventually becomes the head of the Jewish Agency, which is like the shadow government, which will eventually become the state of Israel. The first elections for the Jewish Agency are, I think, already in the 1920s. It's quite early on. So they're already creating institutions that early on. But a lot of people you don't have. As I said, you have, 150,000 Jews in the country. Probably not more than that among the Arabs either. So there are not a lot of people in this area. So how do you create a country where there's not a lot of people? There's a very strange story about Chaim Arlozorov. Chaim Arlozorov worked together with Ben Gurion in the Jewish Agency. Arlozorov was a bit of a visionary. And he wrote a letter to Chaim Weizmann, who at the time was in England. By the way, Chaim Weizmann was very friendly with the British because he created acetone. That's what you use to remove your nail polish from your fingers. It's called acetone. And the British used acetone to make bombs for World War I. So they liked Chaim Weizmann. That's why they're also, when Weizmann got involved in the Zionist movement and asked for the favor of Palestine, they were more inclined to listen to him because of the favor owed to him, which is part of the reason. So Arlozorov writes to Weizmann and says to him, look, we need 1 million Jews here. We can't have a country with the way it is now. How are we going to do it? Richmond says, I don't know. Anyhow, so Arlozorov comes up with a plan. The Nazis take over Germany. Remind me the year. Is it 32, 33? Does anybody remember the exact year? The Nazi Party? I think it's 31 or 32. Let's see. Oh, it's founded already. 1921, Hitler is the Chancellor of Germany. No, excuse me, he was the leader since 1921. He was appointed 1933, excuse me, 1933. Makes more sense. Okay, this is a crazy story. The Nazis are in the government, and I guess for whatever reason, Arlozorov knows that they're gaining power. He meets with, what's his first name? Goebbels, the one who becomes the propaganda minister for the Nazis. Remember, this is the early 30s, like 1931, 32. This is well before the final solution. Nobody was even talking about the final solution in those days. Nobody liked the Nazis, and everybody knew they were anti-Jewish, but the Nazis were climbing to power. Arlozorov has a secret meeting with Goebbels. I think it was 1932. Now, how did he have a secret meeting with Goebbels? This is also a very strange story. Arlozorov was from Berlin, and he had studied there in university. And his best friend in university was this woman by the name of Magda, who grew up in a Jewish family, but she was not Jewish herself. And she married Goebbels. Okay, so she was the wife of Goebbels. So she set up the meeting between Chaim Arlozorov and Goebbels. Arlozorov basically said to him, look, I know the Nazis don't like Jews. We need Jews. Let's work out something. You don't want them? We want them. He came up with an agreement to bring 60,000 Jews to Israel, to Palestine, 1932. By the way, this eventually materialized 33, 34. It took a few years, but this happened 1932. Arlozorov goes back to Palestine. He's living in Tel Aviv. And then one evening, I was either 1933 or 1934. It's a Friday night, and he's walking near what's today the Fishman Beach in the early Tel Aviv, right? Tel Aviv was set up, I told you, by the early 30s. It's already becoming a city. And two people walk over to him and say in broken Hebrew, Ma Shah, what time is it? As he's about to look at his watch, one of them shoots him. His wife, so he falls. His wife runs to the police station and calls an ambulance. He dies on the way to the hospital. And then it becomes the question, who killed Chaim Arlozorov? This was an unsolved enigma for years and years, literally decades, till about 10 years ago. And what happened was, because there were factions already in Israel, you had the labor camp of David Ben-Gurion, you had the revisionists, the students of Zev Jabotinsky, who eventually his student Menachem Begin became the head of the revisionists. And they were constantly fighting between each other how to approach the British, what to do. The labor under David Ben-Gurion talked about negotiating, etc. The revisionists wanted to push the British and make unrest in order to get them to leave the country. These were fights that were going on at the time. And what happened was, when Arlozorov was assassinated, of course, the labor people, Ben-Gurion's people, blamed the revisionists that they had assassinated Chaim Arlozorov. For what reason? Not clear. Rabbi Kook, by the way, who became the chief rabbi already around 1915 of Palestine, he openly said it was not somebody from the Jews who killed Arlozorov. How he knew that, I don't know. But he kept saying that. But this went on, and it created a lot of divisions and a lot of arguments. And for decades, literally, we're talking about, I don't know, 90 years, nobody knew who killed Arlozorov. There was just speculation. So somebody wrote a book about 10 years ago about the Arlozorov case. And it appears that what happened was, according to this book, that the British found out that Arlozorov was bringing 60,000 Jews from Germany. The British also knew that he had sent a letter to Weizmann saying we need 1 million Jews, and it looked like he was starting to be successful. So they weren't sure where the next place he was going to go to do this. The British did not like Chaim Arlozorov. They paid 2 Arabs from Jaffa to assassinate him. How do we know this? His wife went to complain in the British police station. She filed a complaint. The policeman at the time happened to be a Jewish policeman working for the British. And he filled out the complaint. And then what happened was he got a call the next day telling him to close the file of the complaint and throw it away. And he refused. And he started looking for the people because he was told by the wife what they looked like. He actually found 2 people in Jaffa who admitted to the murder of Arlozorov. He went back, he called his superiors again. He says, I actually found the people. And the British said, either you close the case or you're fired. How he collected all this information, this fellow from the book, is quite surprising. But this is basically what came out, that they were afraid of Arlozorov and his talent. They were afraid that it would change the balance of what was going on in the yeshuv at the time. And they had the dirty work done by others. This is the latest theory on the Arlozorov case. Not a great story, but a lot of not such great things happened during that time. But really quite unusual, very unusual case. By the way, there was one other thing similar to that. Also in the 1930s, the British mandate turned to the Germans because in Jerusalem at the time, you had a German group which was called the Templars. The Templars lived in Jerusalem. These were pious German Protestants who had come to the holy city because they thought they had to protect the temple. So they were called the Templars, protect the Temple Mount. There is an area today in Jerusalem called the German Colony. It's called the German Colony because there were many houses that were owned by Templars in that specific area. It's not too far away from where I live. What happened is the British government didn't like the Templars because they were pro-Nazi, and they didn't want to have pro-Nazi people in Palestine. So they worked out a deal with the Nazis that any British citizens who happened to be under Germany, they would exchange for the Templars. So it was a few hundred people who in the middle of the 1930s were exchanged for British subjects who happened to be British subjects, including people who were living in Palestine, happened to move to Germany in the 1930s and got stuck there. I have a friend whose father was saved from the Shoah because he was part of that exchange with the Templars, a few hundred people at the time. So another unusual story, which happened in the 1930s. But of course, as we know, in the 1930s, many German Jews left Germany and came to Palestine because it was very hard after 1930 to find a country that would take Jews. Most of the countries closed their doors in 1930, including the United States, Canada, Britain, France, etc. So, but Palestine was still open. There were white papers, which were drafted by the British limiting immigration to Palestine 3 times. It was called the White Papers. But a certain amount were allowed every year. And many German Jews took this opportunity. And out of the over 500,000 German Jews at the time, probably close to 100,000 of them made their way to Palestine, to Israel at the time, probably including the amount that also came through the deal with Chaim Arlozorov. Huh. Now here we are with coming up to 1947. The war is over. When the war is over in 1945, of course it's 45, 47 I was going to get to. 1945, the war is over. When the war is over, the British make a very big, what I would call publicity mistake. They deny Holocaust survivors from coming to Israel, to Palestine. Just like, other countries are starting to warm up to the idea of accepting Jews because of what happened during the Shoah. But from 1945 till 1948, the British closed their doors to Shoah survivors. If any boats come from Europe to try to come to Palestine, they put them in detention camps in Cyprus. Now, this created an uproar worldwide because people started finding out what happened to the Jews in Germany. And they started saying to the British, this is what you're doing? You're taking these same people and putting them into camps in Cyprus. What's wrong with you? This was called the illegal aliya to Israel, 1945, 1948. In Hebrew, we call it the ma'apilim. Ma'apilim, illegal immigration. Some of the boats came at night, and people would jump off the boats and make it onto the shore in Tel Aviv, and then be arrested in Tel Aviv and brought to, let's say, a prison of the British, but at least they were in the country. Others would be taken to Cyprus. So the British were embarrassed by this worldwide, and nations started saying this is getting ridiculous, it's a bit too much. There was a lot of pressure. There was also a lot of infighting that was going on in Palestine at the time. So eventually the British washed their hands from Palestine. In 1947, the United Nations has the famous partition plan, where they're willing to partition what was at that time Palestine. Well, first the British did that. First, the British gave Transjordan to the Hussein family, who came, I think, from Iraq, and became in charge of what became Transjordan, today Jordan. But then again, the partition plan was partitioning the other side, meaning the east side of the Jordan River, where the state of Israel is today, also into two parts. The Jews accepted, the Arab countries did not. But then there was a war that broke out in 1948, as you know. Now let's jump to 1948. In 1948, the Jewish Agency has established itself as the legitimate agency which represents the Jews in Palestine. And the British have already decided on a date after the UN created the partition vote on the 29th of November, 1947. So the British announced when they would be leaving. And they would be leaving, it was the 14th or the 15th of May, 1948. So Ben-Gurion decided, if we don't declare a state by May 14th, 1948, that'll be our only chance. So he sends a message to Harry Truman, who was the president of the United States. And he says to Truman, look, we want to declare a state. This is our one chance. Truman is nervous. He writes back, he tells the envoy, tell Ben-Gurion, I don't think it's a good idea. From our information, there are 7 Arab countries that want to attack you. And we don't think that you're going to survive this. So we suggest don't declare a state. Give us time. We'll negotiate. We'll try to work out something on your behalf. Truman was actually quite even-handed politician. And Ben-Gurion gets the message, and he sits down with Yigal Yadin, who at that time was in charge of intelligence for the Jewish Agency. And he says, Yigal, what are the chances of our fighters in the Haganah, which was the name of the soldiers that they had put together, right? The labor part had the Haganah, and Menachem Begin's men were called the Irgun Tzvai Leumi. So he says, Yadin, what are our chances of winning against 7 Arab countries with what we have at hand? Yadin says, maybe 50-50. He says. So Ben-Gurion says, when in the last 2,000 years did the Jewish people have such good odds at getting back the land of Israel? That was his answer. despite that answer, a lot of his, what today we would call ministers in the Jewish agency, were very nervous about that. They were warned by Truman it wasn't a good idea, and he did not have a majority. And David Ben-Gurion wanted the state to be democratic, so he wanted it to be a majority. He couldn't get a majority. He convinced this person, convinced that person. Then finally, it was like even. To break it, he called Yehuda Leib Fishman, who changed his name to Maimon, who was one of the members of the Jewish agency who was in Jerusalem at that day. But Jerusalem was under siege by I think it was the Jordanians. So, there was one, it was like local militias. Jerusalem was under siege. So he sent one of these Piper aircrafts to Jerusalem, a little propeller plane, took Rabbi Maimon, who was to Tel Aviv, and then he had his extra man, and he could say that he had a majority. And it was, by the way, May 14th was a Friday. And he wasn't sure if it was he didn't want to declare the state on Shabbat. He didn't want to have a problem with religious people. So he decided to do it in the morning of May 14th, and they declared a state on May 14th. And that's how the state of Israel came around. And then, of course, the next day, there was a war, which was the War of Independence in 1948. Now, the state itself starts off in 1948 with the government, and everything has to go quickly. Because remember also, there's a war going on. It goes on for a few months. They have to pass laws. They have to create a state. It's really not a simple thing to do. There's not a lot of infrastructure. There's not a lot of money. There's not a lot of weapons. There's an interesting story that Golda Meir, who was like very close to Ben-Gurion, she was actually living in Milwaukee in the United States in the 1950s. And Ben-Gurion, she meets Ben-Gurion when he goes to the United States on a fundraising meeting. And she says, I'd like to join you. He says, okay. And that's exactly what happens. She becomes like very a part of his group, and she comes to Israel and becomes very involved in the Ben-Gurion government, later to become a prime minister herself of the state of Israel. So Golda Meir her job was to look for ammunition. One of the first people she approached was Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy Siegel was part of the Chicago Mafia in the United States. He was one of two Jews who were part of the Chicago Mafia. The Chicago Mafia was actually a criminal group in Chicago, but they had lots of guns. So she turned to Bugsy Siegel and said, could you supply weapons for us because we have very little? Siegel says, you mean they're Jews who know how to hold a gun? Like he couldn't believe it. He said, just for that, I'm willing to get you some stuff. So he sold her some weapons. And then, of course, the more serious things, she had meetings in Czechoslovakia, because remember, in 1948, there were two large countries who were the first countries to support the newly born state of Israel, the United States and Russia, the Soviet Union. It's the only time the United States and the Soviet Union actually agreed on something in its history in the United Nations. It was very unusual. But what happened was when the Soviet Union supported Israel, the United States sort of took a back seat. So Golda Meir went to the communist countries, specifically the Czechoslovakia, and there she negotiated a deal of weapons with Czechoslovakia for the state. After that, they got weapons also from France. They got Mirage jets a little bit later in the 1970s. In the 1960s, the United States only becomes close with Israel after 1967. Until 1967, it was other countries. 1967, Russia breaks off relations with Israel, and the United States walks in instead. And then the whole course of politics sort of changes. How does that affect the state? What's going on in the state of Israel at this time? There are different groups that are in Israel this time. And I think the two very educated women who spoke to you over the last few weeks talked about some of these groups in the land of Israel. So if you want to talk about the groups in the land of Israel, it's something like this. You have those who are in the Knesset, in power, which is the labor movement. There are two factions to the labor movement. One of them is called Mapai, Mifleget Poalei Yisrael, which means the party of Israeli workers. Mapai. The second one is called Mapam, which is more socialist. It's like, let's say Mapai is socialist, Mapam is almost communist, and Mapam is Mifleget Poalimu Chadim, which means the party of united workers. But both of them are called workers' parties because these are socialists. They believe in socialism. And they want to bring socialism to the new state of Israel. If anything, Ben Gurion was a very big socialist. He wanted the whole country to be like one big kibbutz. That was his way of understanding it. But anyhow, so they were the government. They controlled most of the seats. They also made a coalition with the religious party, which at that time was called the Mizrahi. It was run by the religious Zionist Jews, but also by some of the Haredi, of the ultra-Orthodox, because in those days, in the first Knesset, the ultra-Orthodox were hesitant of joining the Israeli parliament because they had not joined the Zionist movement of Herzl, because it was a secular movement, so they weren't sure if it was right for them to join the parliament because it was led by secularists. The religious Zionists didn't have a problem with that because they understood that's the situation, but the ultra-Orthodox did. And so they asked the religious Zionists to take care of their needs as well. And that was in the first government set up by Ben Gurion. By the third government, there's already a party, Agudat Yisrael, which represents what we call the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim. But in the first one or even two Knessets, they were afraid to join. The development is actually unusual because even after they join the parliament, they're not sure if they want to be part of the government. After they're part of the government, they don't want to be a minister. Every step on the way was hesitation on their behalf because they really weren't sure how much they wanted to be part. I have to say that even today, the Haredi factions in the Israeli government, what we call the ultra-Orthodox, they do join the government. They are part of even the coalition now, but despite what people say, they play a very small role. Their main reason for being in government is twofold. Number one, to get money for their communities, whatever it might be, for their educational and religious institutions. That's the main reason they're in government. And the second reason is to make sure they can continue their lifestyle without being bothered. So everything you hear about ultra-Orthodox factions that want to make a halachic state, it's 100% fake news. They are totally uninterested in that. I wish they were interested in other things aside from their own communities, but they're not. They're interested in perpetuating their communities. They want to live their lives in insular communities the way they do today. It's true that some of the new generation are more open-minded and interested in the other parts of Israeli society, but still the leadership is very reactionary and is not so interested in getting involved in other parts of Israeli society. So they're definitely not interested in creating a state based on Jewish law or whatever you want to call it. 100% no. It's just a misunderstanding. People on the left use that as in order to get secular people to be nervous every time the ultra-Orthodox factions enter the Knesset. But you can count on one hand the laws that the ultra-Orthodox factions have passed since they entered the Knesset in like 1952. That few. Just to understand, there are hundreds of laws that are passed every year by every parliament. So the fact that you have maybe 5 and the ultra-Orthodox really means that they have no real interest in that. But what they are interested in is, again, money for their institutions, educational and religious, money for childbirth, because that's an important part of their culture, synagogues, things like that. So that's their main interest. In other political issues, most of the time they have been neutral. Lately, because they've been mostly the right-wing coalition, they became a little bit more right-wing. But it's more to accommodate the people than the actual leadership itself. The leadership doesn't care as much, but because the people sort of do, yeah. Having said that, I have to say, if I talk about the parties in Israel, so I just explained the Agudat Yisrael party, which is the ultra-Orthodox party. Have you ever heard that name before? Or is this the first time? Maybe it's the first time. There's another Haredi party that exists in Israel. It's called Shas. Shas is really backwards. It's supposed to be Sfaradim Shomrei Torah, which means religious or Torah. Sfaradim who keep the Torah. That's what it means. Basically means ultra-Orthodox Sfaradim. Now, the idea of ultra-Orthodox Sfaradim is a new concept. It didn't exist in the 19th century or in the early 20th century because Sfaradim didn't have this idea of insular communities like the Ashkenazim did. I told you the whole idea of ultra-Orthodox was insular communities. They break themselves off not only from the non-Jewish world, but even from the secular Jewish world in order to keep their communities the way they were before. Sfaradim didn't have that concept. So how did it come about? In the 1970s, there were young Sfaradim who their parents wanted them to be religious and were afraid they were leaving religion. They sent them to ultra-Orthodox yeshivot, academies of study, specifically the Ponevezh Yeshiva in Bnei Brak. One of these young men, his name was Aryeh Deri, who came from a Moroccan family. Deri became very close with the leaders of the ultra-Orthodox camp, the Ashkenazic ultra-Orthodox camp. And because he was very talented, Rabbi Shach, who was the head of the yeshiva in those days, he said to Deri, you know what? We should have an ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party because there are more of them than us. So they can help us support our academies, our yeshivot. Deri said, great idea. Who you think of getting involved? He says, I'll talk to Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. So Rabbi Shach was actually the founder. Rabbi Shach, who was Ashkenazi from Lithuania, was actually the founder of the Sephardic Shas party. He got together with Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Rabbi Yosef had the idea that Aryeh Deri would be his right-hand man. And they launched in about 1980 in Jerusalem. Their first experiment was trying to be part of the municipality. They won 4 seats in the Jerusalem municipality that year, and then they realized they had a chance at going to the Knesset, to the parliament. 2 years later, or 3 years later, whenever the election was, they ran for the parliament and they got about 6 seats, which was really a phenomenon at the time because it was more than the ultra-Orthodox party itself. They went as high as 17 seats, the Shas party, because a lot of the Sephardim in Israel felt that the country had not integrated them properly. And they started voting for Shas party, not because it was ultra-Orthodox, but because it was Sephardi. Now, so the Shas party was a very unusual conglomerate because it was made up of people who were mostly not Orthodox, but maybe traditional Sfaradim, who liked the idea of a Sephardic party and didn't care that it was ultra-Orthodox. That didn't bother them. And that's what, to this day, they are still the majority of the Shas party. Till this day, 2023. So the Shas party still gets 7, 8, sometimes 10 seats. And most of the people are Sfaradim who are maybe traditionalists, but like the idea that this is a very traditionalist and Sephardic party. They see that as, they take pride in that. Am I losing you, or does any of this make sense? Maybe I'm talking too much about Israeli politics, and it's very novel to you.
It's okay. It's okay. You don't
Well,
lose us.
Well, maybe you know, but maybe the others don't. I just don't know.
Oh, it's interesting. Keep going.
It's okay.
It's interesting, yes.
So we talked about two parties so far. One of them is the ultra-Orthodox party, the original one from 1952. It's called Agudat Yisrael. This is, by the way, the name of the group of Orthodox Jews already from 1914. They called themselves Agudat Yisrael, the political branch of the ultra-Orthodox. They already set themselves up outside of Israel as an organization, 1914. That was also the year they decided they were non-Zionist. That's why they had such a hard time joining the government. If they're non-Zionist, how do they join a government of a state of Israel, which is obviously the outcome of Zionism? That's why I'm saying they lived this friction. It was very difficult for them in the early years because it was like confusing. It took them many years to, what changed it? What changed it was the Shas party. Since the Shas party was an ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party, and they had lots of power, and which gave them lots of money for their institutions. And the trick was Shas had no problem taking ministers because they knew when you have a ministry, you get more money. So what happened was the Agudat Yisrael, the Ashkenazic ultra-Orthodox said, hey, we can't be second fiddle. We also have to have ministers. And then finally they completely got involved in so it was really the Shas party which dragged in the Agudat Yisrael party into the government 100%. What other things do you have in the Israeli government which exists from day one? I talked about the Labor Party, which had two parts to it, Mapai Mapam. And I talked about, and the next party was the Revisionist Party, which ideologue was Jabotinsky, who had died before the state of Israel. But his student, Menachem Begin, was the head of the Cherut, that's what it was called, Cherut, the Freedom Party of the Revisionists, since 1948, and before, by the way, and before the state. So already in the 40s. Begin and David Ben-Gurion did not get along. This happened with a fallout that they had during the War of Independence. The beginning of the War of Independence, Menachem Begin was asked by David Ben-Gurion to disband his fighting group, which was called the Haganah. He said, why should I disband it? You disband your group and become us. Why should we disband our group and become you? Who decided that? So Ben-Gurion didn't like that. And he was very rough with Begin. Begin at one point brought in, right at the beginning of the War of Independence, he brought in a boat of ammunition called the Altalena. And it was just docked outside of Tel Aviv, and it was approaching Tel Aviv to land. And Ben-Gurion said to him on the wireless or whatever they had there, either you give us the ammunition completely and disband, or we are going to bomb your boat. So Begin said, we're not giving it to you, we're fighting alongside you together with our men. Ben-Gurion didn't believe him, so he sent his right-hand man, who is Yitzhak Rabin, and he said, go down there and bomb the boat. So Rabin came with a whole group of people from the Haganah on the Tel Aviv beach at Frishman, and they started firing at the Altalena, where Menachem Begin was. Menachem Begin's men said, look, we have ammunition, let's start firing back. They're trying to kill us. Begin said to them, and this is a famous statement, he said, we are not going to fight with our brothers. I would rather die. Famous story of the Altalena. The Altalena did sink. Most of the people survived and swam to shore. But it's a very important episode in our history because it's hard to know if history would have changed if they would have fought against the Haganah. What happened was after the Altalena, the Haganah and the Irgun fought together in the War of Independence. Only after the War of Independence was finished did the Irgun disband And they became Tzva Hagana Israel, what today we call Tzahal, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. So the Israel Defense Force eventually was a conglomeration of the Irgun of Menachem Begin and the Haganah of David Ben-Gurion. But during the war, they fought separately. They had different tasks, each one. So I just wanted to mention that point. So Begin, in that sense, really showed leadership. I'm not saying that David Ben-Gurion didn't show leadership, but he made a mistake there. Even great leaders can make mistakes, and Begin saved the day on that one. I think also he got the wrong information from the people working with him. Remember, leaders are also dependent on information. And supposedly some of the people told him that these weapons were not going to go to the Haganah. So, whatever. That's another story. Anyhow, so in the Knesset, the faction led by Menachem Begin was called Cherut. Cherut did not have a lot of seats in the first Knesset, maybe 7, 8. It was not a large faction at the time, but they did exist in the parliament. It will take till 1977 for Menachem Begin to get a majority in the Israeli parliament. So again, you have the difference between Cherut of Menachem Begin and the party of Ben-Gurion, which is called Mapai Mapam, or the Labor Party, which is called a little bit later, is the Labor Party is socialist, and the students of Jabotinsky are not. They believe in capitalism and free market. That's the major difference, by the way. Because the socialism is a secular movement, there are a lot of people within the socialist camp who were secular, but it was like a dominant, it wasn't necessarily a fanatic secularism, but it was secular. Basically, Ben-Gurion saw his parties as secular parties. They were willing to make treaties and alliances with the religious parties, but they did not see their parties as such. The Cherut party, which was interesting because it had a lot of traditionalists and even some religious people in the Cherut party. Menachem Begin himself was a traditionalist, so some of the traditionalists felt a little bit more at home in the Cherut party of Menachem Begin. But of course, the dominant party, since it was Mapai Mapam, they were the ones who made the coalitions with the two religious parties at the time, which was the religious Zionists of the Mizrahi and the ultra-Orthodox of the Agudat Yisrael before the Shas party came to the scene. I have to say one other thing, and I think that'll be enough for today. And that is that until 1967, politically, there's not a lot of difference between Cherut and the Labor Party. Ben-Gurion today, we would consider him right-wing. He did not believe in giving land away. If anything, he did whatever he could to expand the borders of the land of Israel. He had no interest in negotiating a Palestinian state. He didn't believe that there was such a thing as the Palestinian people. And remember, the term Palestinian people starts in the 1970s, 1963. It's actually developed by Yasser Arafat, who at that time was in Jordan. Before that, he was a student in Egypt. And until 1967, by the way, it's called the Arab-Israel conflict. We call it the Arab-Israel conflict until the 1970s. And that's what it was called worldwide. It was called the Arab-Israel conflict. And all the Arab countries were involved in this conflict. This is something also to talk about how the switchover happened. And the changeover by the mindset happened during the time that Netanyahu was prime minister. Today, the whole scenario of the Middle East has changed. Today, most Arab countries are not against Israel anymore. Let's look at today the countries in the Middle East who are against Israel. Iran, it's not Arab. It's Muslim, but it's not Arab, right? Okay, Qatar doesn't like Israel. But Qatar, if Saudi Arabia tells them what to do, they do it. You know what I mean? Because Saudi Arabia is like the big brother, Qatar is the little guy. So if the Saudis say what to do, they do that. You have Turkey, who keeps changing its mind, but Turkey is also not Arab. Turkey was very anti-Israel. Now they're sort of sitting on the border, on the line. They haven't decided. Sometimes they're pro, sometimes they're not. Those are the main ones. Those are really the main factions. Iran is the one who now gives all the money to the Hezbollah and to the Hamas. And the Arab countries don't seem to be as interested. Let me give you an example. Saudi Arabia this week came out with a public statement to Joe Biden, because Biden said that he wanted the Saudis to warm up to Israel. It was very interesting. I didn't think he would do that. So he said to the Saudis, tell me what your 4 conditions are. The Saudis made 4 conditions, and for the first time since 1967, none of the conditions were a Palestinian state. Until now, the Saudis said, until there's a Palestinian state, we're not going to make peace with Israel. They didn't say that this time. 4 conditions, and it's not that. So I'm just saying that the Arab countries are looking at Israel and the Middle East differently today. That doesn't solve the problems, but at least it makes it negotiable. There's somebody to talk to. And hopefully, I'm an optimist. I believe there will be peace in the Middle East. And I think that the Arab countries will warm up to the idea of negotiation. And the only way to do negotiation in the Middle East, if there's going to be negotiation without another war, is to get as many countries as involved and to hammer it out. And the more they warm up to Israel, the more compromise will be something which will be a legitimate word, which it was not in the past. So I'll end on that optimistic point of view, which I totally believe in, by the way. And I don't mind if people call me a blind optimist. That doesn't bother me. So we need a lot of blind optimists in order for this to happen. So I don't think I'm a blind optimist. No, I think I'm well aware of what's going on. Okay, I was just describing then the factions that were in the Israeli parliament of 1948. And what I'd like to do next time, which will probably when I see you, because next Thursday we're not going to meet, I want to talk about, again, what happens. You already talked about a little bit the Sephardim, you talked about the religious Zionists, and the ultra-Orthodox. I want to talk about how it plays out in Israeli society until Menachem Begin takes over, because what happens in the politics, since we're such a small country, influences also the way that people see themselves. It's not 100% one for one. There are some discrepancies, but because it's a small country, this does have an effect, one or the other. The politics has an effect on the people. It's not like where I grew up in Canada, that people didn't know who was in the government and didn't care. And in Israel, everybody knows who's in the government, except for, let's say, people who are new to the country. So there you have people who don't really know. Okay, merci beaucoup, everybody. And I wish you bunasera. And we will meet again, hopefully in...
Excuse me, sir. Okay.
Yes.